I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and today's hearing is on H.R. 702, legislation to prohibit restrictions on the export of crude oil. We have one panel of witnesses this morning, and I'll introduce each of you individually right before you give your opening statement, but we're very excited about this panel of witnesses because they have a great deal of expertise and can give us some insights into the positive and any negative impacts that might occur if we lift the restrictions on export of crude oil. And I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank, first of all, Congressman Joe Barton of Texas, Chairman Emeritus of this committee, for introducing this bill. He has bipartisan support on this bill, and it certainly raises an issue that there is more and more discussion about around the country and around the world. Americans believe in free trade, and our nation has greatly benefited from policies that allow us to export our products around the world. Everyone from farmers to automakers enjoy the advantages of a global economic and customer base. However, oil does remain basically an exception to the rule. 1970 era's restrictions still prohibit most exports of American crude. But as we all know, the reasons for these restrictions are certainly different than they were in the 70s. Most significantly, we've gone from a nation with dwindling petroleum output to the world's #1 producer of liquid hydrocarbons. In fact, American production growth has been so robust that the domestic supply of oil is now outstripping demand. This is especially true for the lighter grades of crude not suitable for most domestic refiners, but still very much in demand around the world. Allowing American companies to serve this global market would provide substantial economic as well as geopolitical benefits, and that is what H.R. 702 seeks to remedy. There's been tremendous job growth associated with increased oil and gas production over the last decade, and it should be noted that this includes many jobs far away from the nation's oil fields, such as those manufacturing the equipment used by these energy companies. Unfortunately, we've seen the loss of thousands of direct and indirect oil jobs over the past year as supplies have exceeded demand and prices have dropped. New production is being cut back not because of a shortage of places to drill, but because of a shortage of customers. Lifting the export restrictions and allowing the market for American oil to extend beyond our own borders could create nearly 1 million additional jobs, according to estimates from a lot of different groups. Put another way, these are jobs that would already exist today if the export ban was not in place. The pro-export consensus is a broad one, including groups across the political spectrum, from the Brookings Institute to the Bipartisan Policy Center to the Heritage Foundation. It also includes numerous high-ranking Obama and Clinton administration officials, as well as many who served under both Bush administrations. Of course, one of the concerns that we always hear about is we want to be sure to keep gasoline as affordable as possible, and would this have an impact on gasoline prices? I think most people would agree that this would certainly not cause gasoline prices to increase, but that's an area that when we get into questions, I'm sure we'll be asking some of our witnesses about. I might also say that the Energy Information Administration, Government Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office predict that oil exports would actually help lower the prices at the pump. Just one more benefit of oil exports. So we look forward to a great hearing this morning. Many members are open to the discussion. They have not made any kind of decision about this, but as I said in the beginning, there's more and more discussion about this issue around the country, and we do look forward to the testimony of our so-called experts this morning. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today on H.R. 702 legislation to prohibit restrictions on the export of crude oil, which was introduced by my good friend and colleague, the chairman emeritus of this full committee, Mr. Joe Barton of Texas. Mr. Chairman, as we enter into the era of new American energy renaissance, I think that it's entirely appropriate for this subcommittee to revisit the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. This policy, which restricts the export of domestically produced crude oil, may in fact be outdated as conditions today have shifted dramatically from the 1970s when the bill was first enacted. While I come to this issue, Mr. Chairman, of crude oil exports with an open mind, I believe that there are a variety of ways that this issue could be structured. I look forward to engaging the witnesses on the questions of lifting the ban entirely, as H.R. 702 would, or with conditions to protect the American consumer against unforeseen consequences. Another option, Mr. Chairman, which we should consider is exporting crude oil regionally to targeted areas in order to maximize American diplomacy and leverage. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I'm currently working on a bill that will remove limitations on the export of energy resources to Cuba. My bill will promote market access for the efficient exploration, production, storage, supply, and distribution of energy resources to our neighbor 30 miles off the coast of Florida. This would include the exploitation of crude oil, as well as American technology and technical assistance in developing Cuba's clean and renewable energy sectors. Mr. Chairman, I think it is very important to look at what the effect of displacing oil from our foreign competitors and opponents, and whether it be Russia or Venezuela, and replacing it with U.S. energy resources, what the effect might have on our overall national security and diplomatic objectives. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from today's panel of witnesses on how lifting this ban might impact the American economy in terms of manufacturing, employment, gasoline prices, and imports. Mr. Chairman, in addition to examining the domestic impacts of lifting the ban, it is also important to look at the impacts to our national security and our overall global diplomacy objectives. So, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward on the path to enacting an American energy strategy for the 21st century, it is vital that we examine policies that may have run their course in light of the new realities of our time. I think today's hearing is both timely and essential to examining some of these critically important issues, and I look forward to engaging today's witnesses. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I'd like to recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton of Michigan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America's energy picture has changed dramatically, and this committee has been working hard to keep pace. Clearly, times have changed since the 1970s when the oil export ban was put into place. Few back then would have imagined a domestic oil glut that jeopardizes new drilling and the jobs that will go with it, but that's the situation that many experts say that we face today. The energy sector has been the nation's most significant job creator over the past decade. But the recent drop in oil prices, as many as 100,000 energy industry jobs, in fact, have been lost. Proponents of the legislation that we're considering today argue that allowing American oil on the global market would boost production and bring back those lost jobs and, in fact, add quite a few more. And the demand for American oil is there, especially from our allies who want to reduce their dependence on a market dominated by unfriendly and unstable nations. As I stated in the previous hearing with Secretary Moniz, we need to get this policy right. Yes, we do. We need to be certain that any actions taken don't have unintended consequences that negate the benefits. The question of what to do with our incredible resource abundance is a great kind of problem to have. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on that issue. And I would yield to other members wishing time. Mr. Barton, I yield time.
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Whitfield for hosting this hearing. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Rush, for the open mind that he expressed in his opening statement. This is an important issue for me, obviously. The other subcommittee chairman here, Mr. Pitts and Mr. Shimkus, can testify that I don't show up on time to many hearings in the morning, but I'm here for this one because it's a big deal. The issue that we're debating today is the last remnant of the Carter scarcity of energy policy of the 1970s. We have a former Assistant Secretary of Energy out in the audience, Mr. Jan Mayers, who was in the Reagan Department of Energy in the early 80s. And when the Reagan administration came into office, you had in place an energy policy that said America was running out of energy. And we had restricted the use of natural gas. We had put price controls on natural gas. We had done all kinds of things because we thought America was out of energy and America could not compete in energy policies. Beginning with President Reagan and continuing through President Clinton and President Bush, we have repealed every bit of that policy except one thing, and that's this: the issue that America cannot export crude oil. We can export everything else in America, but we can't export crude oil. We can export refined products, but we can't export crude oil. We've had hearings on this in the Ag Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Small Business Committee, but until today we've not held a hearing in the Committee of Jurisdiction, which is our committee. I think if you listen to the witnesses, especially my good friend Ambassador Gondolovic from the Czech Republic, you will see the absolute positivism of repealing this ban. America is number one in energy production. It's number one in oil production. If we can use our energy resources strategically, it will help us in that area, but it will also help us economically, as Chairman Upton has just pointed out. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rush, for agreeing to have this hearing. Thank the witnesses. And with that, I'm willing to yield another minute to anybody on our side that wishes. Mr. Mullen of Oklahoma. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to just reiterate what my friend from Texas was saying. Also, point out the fact that this is about bringing stability to a market. In Oklahoma alone, we've lost 20,000 jobs since January. You know, an entrepreneur that is able to understand what the sacrifices means is with us today, sitting over there in the corner, Harold Hamm, an individual that started with absolutely nothing and was able to achieve the successes because of barriers that was lifted and taken out of place. But today we're limiting entrepreneurs like him. And this is something that we need to have an open conversation about. And I thank the chairman for bringing this to our attention. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, Mr. Pallone was going to make an opening statement, but I think he's been delayed. So is there anyone?
No, Mr. Chairman, we want to reserve Mr. Pallone's time until he arrives.
Okay, we'll reserve Mr. Pallone's time, and when he arrives, he can give his opening statement. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses and recognize each one of them for 5 minutes for their opening statement. Our first witness is Mr. Peter Gondolovic, who is the ambassador to the United States for the Czech Republic. I'm just going to introduce you individually before you give your opening statement. Mr. Ambassador, we're delighted you're with us this morning, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the Subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to provide my perspective on the utmost importance of the strategic energy alliance between the United States and Europe as energy exports from democratic countries like the United States enhance the energy security of the Czech Republic and the European Union. Since 1989, when we re-established our independence, we have always known that we cannot achieve true state sovereignty without having energy sovereignty. Bearing this in mind, one of the first steps of our revived independent diplomacy was to start negotiations with Germany on the building of a new transit oil pipeline that would connect us with the Western markets and diminish our previous 100% dependence on oil supplies from East, namely Russia. This truly strategic decision was successfully materialized in the IKL, it means Ingolstadt-Kralupy-Litvinov pipeline, which has connected us via Germany with the Italian seaport of Trieste at the Adriatic coast. The existence of that oil pipeline has given us the opportunity to import oil from international markets. Nowadays, we import around 1/2 of our oil consumption through this pipeline. It is interesting that most of this oil comes from Azerbaijan, which flows via Georgia to Turkish port of Ceyhan on the coast of Mediterranean Sea, then to the port of Trieste in Italy, and then through the Alps to Germany, and finally via this IKL pipeline to the Czech Republic, or oil from Kazakhstan that follows a similar route. What is crucial for our energy security is that the capacity of this IKL pipeline is large enough that in case of emergency we can practically cover our oil needs from other than Russia territory and potentially also from the US. Moreover, we have also done our homework in the area of natural gas. In the 90s, we signed a contract with Norway that diminished our 100% dependence on deliveries from the east. We also built the so-called Gazelle pipeline that has interconnected us, our gas transit network, with the German one. Thanks to this interconnection, we have been significantly integrated with the German and European gas market, and as a result, we also buy natural gas on spot markets in Western Europe. This interconnection with Germany also provides us with an alternative supply route in case of extraordinary supply disruptions from the east. Apart from the diversification of transit routes, we have always given particular importance to diversification of energy sources. Therefore, our energy mix has been based on nuclear energy, coal, oil, gas, hydro, and renewables. I mentioned that energy security has always been a priority to the Czech Republic. Since 2004, we've been trying hard to emphasize the issue of energy security within the European Union in general. We made energy security one of the official priorities during our presidency in 2009. We led negotiations during this gas crisis between Russia and Ukraine, finalized the third EU energy package, which is the crucial component of the European energy legislation, and organized the so-called Southern Corridor Summit. Energy has always been on top of the so-called Visegrad Group, V4, so-called, it's the grouping of countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. And it's one of the official priorities of its current Czech presidency. The V4 group strives for energy sources diversification, and with its demand reaching 42 cubic meters of natural gas per year and almost 40 million tons of oil per year, accounts for an important European regional market. As I mentioned earlier, we always keep in mind that we have to do our homework. Thanks to this approach, I am glad to be able to say that energy security of the Czech Republic has reached a very good level. It is important to stress that our energy security is based on the assumption that access to the global markets means access to oil and gas exported by countries that see energy as business and not as a political tool. Hence, I would like to reiterate the crucial statement. The larger the number of stable democracies among the world energy exporters, the more robust the energy security of the Czech Republic and the European Union will be. Moreover, U.S. energy exports would send a strong signal to the world community that democracies stick together. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members, thank you for your attention.
Mr. Ambassador, thanks for that opening statement. Our next witness is Commander Kirk Lippold, who's retired from the U.S. Navy and is now president of Lippold Strategies. And we're delighted you're with us this morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, my name is Commander Kirk Lippold. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. While I may disagree with this bill, I would like to personally thank Representative Joe Barton for his dedicated support to our armed forces, specifically our veterans. Sir, you have made service to our nation a source of pride for our citizens. In my 26-year career in the Navy, I was a surface warfare officer serving on 5 different ships, including guided missile cruisers and destroyers, to protect U.S. national security interests across the globe. Foremost among those missions was to safeguard the sea lanes of communication, or SLOCs, that facilitate the global economy, including oil imports to the United States. I have experienced firsthand, particularly during my command of the USS Cole when it was attacked by al-Qaeda terrorists during a routine refueling stop, the devastating effects of reliance on imported oil when the men and women who serve our country are placed in harm's way. The U.S. Navy has a unique role in the world in cooperation with our allies to ensure the safe conduct of trade, including oil. Since the 1970s, we have had policies in place to encourage energy independence that include investment in energy research and efficiency, diversity of fuel inputs, and the strict regulation of oil exports. At its heart, the legislation being contemplated before this committee will have far-reaching national security implications. Before we drastically alter the law and these long-standing and successful policies, we should proceed with great caution to evaluate their real-world consequences. The United States is still import-dependent, despite significant gains in domestic energy production. While the U.S. has experienced an impressive boom in domestic crude oil production, a blunt fact persists. The U.S. remains overly dependent on those oil imports. We still import a staggering amount of oil. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the U.S. imports in 2014 totaled more than 2.6 billion barrels, or around 30% of supply. Another key point is that domestic consumption will outpace domestic production for the foreseeable future. There are significant national security benefits to decreasing our reliance on imported oil supplies. It keeps the nation focused and working toward achieving energy independence. It markedly decreases our reliance on unfriendly or dangerous regimes that do not share our interests or values. Lastly, and most importantly, energy independence leaves the U.S. and its leaders with more workable options in achieving our foreign policy and national security objectives. History, as always, is instructive. The original purpose of the export regulations was to bolster national security by furthering energy independence. That purpose still holds true. Lifting export regulations may have the unintended consequence of undermining our national security goal of energy independence. Given the current strategic environment, precipitously lifting the regulation of exports would not confer equal strategic benefits. Advocates of lifting the export ban frequently point to Russia's aggressive invasion in Ukraine as a ready opportunity for the use of energy diplomacy. That notion makes little sense. As an initial matter, all credible economic studies on the subject project that the vast majority of U.S. crude oil purchased on world markets would make their way to Asia, not Europe. Indeed, the #1 beneficiary of lifting the ban is likely to be China, a nation whose recent activities in the Pacific and South China Sea reflect more the actions of a rival hegemon for security dominance in the Trans-Pacific region than a responsible international partner. The U.S. does not need to export crude oil to influence international markets. With strict export regulations in place, other countries are better off because the U.S. is producing more of its own supply, which increases the supply of crude outside the U.S., thereby reducing prices and alleviating bottlenecks. With the export ban staying in place, the U.S. gets the dual national security benefits of ample supply and leverage on the international stage. Another key consideration is the need to maintain a strong domestic refining base that provides the U.S. with significant and underappreciated national security benefits. Lifting the crude export ban would expose one of America's most important industries to the unpredictable vagaries of international markets and international politics. Military assets mobilize on petroleum products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. They do not run on crude. Maintaining and expanding our robust refining base directly improves the operational flexibility the U.S. requires for rapid mobilization necessary for modern force protection. While tempting from the perspective of gaining a commercial foothold in a new market arena at this time, too many times in my career, I have experienced the stark reality of our national leaders not thinking through the impact of changes in international and domestic policy. We cannot afford to wave off these potential consequences as inconsequential under the guise of market principles. The regulation of crude oil exports was put in place with the long-term objective of decreasing U.S. reliance on foreign sources of energy, specific oil. The day may come when the U.S. is no longer overly dependent on oil imports, and we may be in a position to change our export laws. But for the sake of our national security, that day is not today.
Thank you, Commander. Our next witness is Dr. David Montgomery, who's Senior Vice President for NERA Economic Consulting Group, and thanks for being with us. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rush. It's a privilege to appear before you today, and I very much appreciate your invitation. I have retired as Senior Vice President of NERA Economic Consulting, though I continue to work with my team there and on other things that are interesting. I've found that's a great benefit of retirement. What I'd like to do in my 4 minutes and 40 seconds is give a quick overview of the major conclusions of my testimony and then just touch on a few elementary points in a little more detail. My conclusion, and I think the conclusion of every independent study that has tried to quantify the effects of the crude oil export ban, is that restrictions on crude oil export pose a cost on the economy in several forms. They cause us to lose domestic production of crude oil that we would otherwise be able to produce. They cause a loss in investment and corresponding economic growth. They have done so for the past several years and will continue to do so. Oil export restrictions actually lead to higher gasoline prices than we would have had in the recent past and going forward. And finally, it's my conclusion that restrictions on crude oil exports actually decrease our energy security. And I will try to amplify a bit on each of those points. How is it that production is reduced? The evidence that production is reduced by restrictions on crude oil exports is the differential that we see in the market between the price of the light, tight oil that is what the boom in oil production in the United States has produced. The boom in oil production has come about because we have discovered ways, the oil industry discovered ways, to produce oil from tight formations that were not previously possible to produce. That oil is light oil because that is what the production technology is able to extract, and that's what's there. The light oil is coming from Texas, from Oklahoma, from New Mexico, from North Dakota, the major sources. Huge amounts of that oil growing rapidly over the last few years. The problem is the U.S. refining sector is set up to process heavy oil, and it can't simply swap one for the other. So since the oil can't be exported, it's been stuck in the United States and its price has been depressed. When we did our study at NERA a year and a half or so ago, the price of oil produced in North Dakota, where the famous Bakken field is, was selling at about the same discount from international market crudes as it is today. That means that there is a disincentive for production and we're losing production. That is what leads in large part to the negative effects on the economy, which are taking the form of less investment, less growth in the oil and gas sector. And just let me remind you that over the past couple of years, the oil and gas sector has been the primary source behind economic growth overall. It has been the major growing sector in the economy. So we would lose that stimulus. Let me turn then to the effect on consumers, gasoline prices. It only takes one sentence to raise the fear that gasoline prices will go up. It takes about 4 to explain why they will go down. But the key factor here is that it is net imports that matter. It's net imports that matter for the effect of the U.S. on world oil markets and net imports that matter for national security. Net imports are basically the difference between how much crude oil we produce in the United States and how much oil we consume in the United States. Since it would take massive refinery investments to be able to use the light oil that we're now producing in the Bakken and other places in U.S. refineries, it is much more economic to export that oil than it is to expend all that money to refine the products domestically. But it makes absolutely no difference to our total call on oil markets because that is determined by how much how much hydrocarbon we're producing in liquid form and how much hydrocarbon we're consuming in liquid form. All the change in oil exports does is it allows us to avoid wasteful investments in refineries domestically, to use the oil here, to export that oil and actually increase the world's total oil supply. That's the important part. By removing the restrictions on crude oil exports, we will increase the world's oil supply. That will tend to drive down the price of oil on world markets, of crude oil. Now, the price of refined products is based on the price of crude oil in the world market. U.S. refineries are already exposed. They export 4 million barrels per day of products. They see prices go up and down all the time. The price of gasoline in the United States is determined by that world market. If we soften the price of crude oil in the world market, we reduce gasoline prices in the United States. And the same thing is true of energy security. Even if we take Commander Lippold's definition of energy security, and I agree with everything else he said, I think we differ on the issue of whether it's imports to the U.S. or net imports that matter. I think it's far worse than what Commander Lippold described. The U.S. the world oil market is one market. We can't just defend ships going to the United States and ships coming from the United States. We're affected by the world oil price, and we will be forever because even EIA sees no prospect of oil independence in the U.S. That means if there's a supply disruption anywhere, it's going to affect the U.S. If there are military interventions, we're going to have to defend everybody's ships, not just ours. But if we increase our oil exports, one of the likely consequences is Persian Gulf countries will cut back their production, and that removes a major source of risk. Let me conclude my testimony at this point. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Montgomery. And our next witness is Mr. Mark Krinbow, who is the group president of the Gorman-Rupp Company, and we appreciate your being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and committee members, for this invitation to testify and support lifting the ban of U.S. crude oil exports. Gorman-Rupp started in 1933 by two entrepreneurs, J.C. Gorman and H.E. Rupp, in Mansfield, Ohio. Currently, Jeff Gorman is our CEO in third generation. We design, manufacture, and sell pumps into many different markets. The oil and gas market uses our equipment in several different areas, primarily for water transfer and wastewater transfer, directly or indirectly related to the energy industry. In October of 2014, we started our planning process for our 2015 forecast budget. 2014 was a good year, and the outlook for 2015 was looking to be even better. We planned on a 12.5% increase in sales with a corresponding operating budget. I've provided in my testimony a chart that correlates the number of gas and oil rigs to our incoming orders. When the price of oil went down and the number of drilling rigs were reduced, our business was impacted. A distributor in Texas was planning a major expansion until drilling activity reduced. A Canadian distributor anticipated levels of business that ended up being cut back significantly. The combination of just these two distributors accounts for $4 million of canceled orders on our books. The impact of our business has been a surplus of inventory and a reduction in workload that's required the elimination of all but essential overtime. 13 temporary employees were terminated. These traditionally have been temp to full-time employees. We've implemented voluntary unpaid leave of absences. Wage increases were postponed due to business conditions. All hiring is scrutinized. There are 21 retirements, of which only a portion will be replaced. Our full-time employees is 25 less than the end of last year. We have not hired summer help. Traditionally, we hire college students bound for college of the Gorman-Rupp employees. Capital expenditures have been postponed on items that are not essential to the operation. I put my company example forward as typical of what's happening in tens of thousands of energy supply chain companies throughout the United States. While my numbers may not make the news, the aggregate of all similar stories throughout the country has a profound impact on American workers and the total U.S. jobs and growth picture. Lifting the ban will help turn this around. Here are several important reasons why. It would remove the competitive disadvantage and allow the U.S. to compete in the worldwide battle for energy market share. New production will drive substantial additional investment in products and services from crude oil supply chain, generating up to $63 billion of supply chain economic output nationally. This investment would create 440,000 new supply chain jobs nationally by 2018. These export-dependent jobs and GDP growth would be widely spread throughout the American economy. They would exist in all 50 states and throughout 60 different industry sectors. Of the national supply chain gains, 10 of the top 15 states gaining jobs are non-producing states. By GDP growth, 11 of the 15 states are non-producing states. The Energy Equipment and Infrastructure Alliance, of which my company is a member, estimate there is at least 120,000 supply chain businesses and 615,000 workers supporting American oil and natural gas production, 100,000 of which are small businesses. The U.S. energy sector has been a leader in developing new technologies for energy exploration and extraction. Taking advantage of those technological advances before competitors do would give the U.S. energy industry incentives to innovate and become even better at finding and extracting oil and natural gas in an efficient and safe manner. Lifting the oil ban on crude oil exports is a step that could yield almost immediate results at a time when the United States continues to see sluggish growth in the kind of good jobs and the energy sector provides. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to address your committee.
Well, thank you for your opening statement. And Mr. Pallone has arrived, and he's the ranking member of our full committee, and I'd like to recognize him for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, for bearing with me today. We've been working on the 20th century cures and bringing it to the floor on a bipartisan basis, so I appreciate the opportunity. I also wanted to thank the Commander Lippold for your service to our country. As I've said before, it's not a bad idea to reconsider the merits of a policy enacted in the wake of the 1973 oil embargo. The world is very different than it was 40 years ago, and our energy picture is evolving rapidly. Domestic oil production has increased dramatically in recent years, and demand growth has slowed noticeably. The current relatively low price of oil and the increase in domestic production benefit us all. Low oil prices boost our GDP and decrease the amount Americans spend at the pump. However, there's no guarantee that these conditions will last. We still import much of our oil, and while oil prices may might remain where they are. Gasoline prices have already risen significantly since our March hearing on this issue. Many factors could change the future energy picture, including geopolitical instability and international domestic market forces. These are important issues to consider before shipping the oil we produce here to countries around the world. And that's why we need to better understand where exported oil will go, whether it be to Asia, Europe, or other locations. I welcome the Czech ambassador, and I'm interested to hear about what type of U.S. oil could benefit his country as he spoke. I believe that we need to answer a host of complicated questions before considering a wholesale dismantling of our nation's ability to restrict oil exports as proposed in H.R. 702. First, how would lifting the ban affect the price of crude oil and therefore the price of gasoline? I don't think there's a consensus on that point, though I think my constituents would all agree the prices of the pump are still far too high. Exports may help oil companies, but will they really benefit consumers? Second, how would such a change affect both our refinery capacity and associated jobs? How would exporting crude oil instead of finished petroleum products affect job growth in the years ahead? Some, like the steel workers, want to keep and grow those jobs in the U.S. Exporting the oil could mean exporting those jobs and paying a higher price for gasoline. Third, if we're going to export crude oil, shouldn't the American people receive some direct benefit in the form of increased revenues? Shouldn't we consider a fee on exports to ensure all Americans benefit from the exploitation and exporting of their natural resources? And fourth, what are the environmental and climate impacts of lifting the export ban? Are we still going to put our beaches and oceans at risk just to add oil to the world market? Increasing crude exports means increasing impacts on climate change, public health, and safety, property owners, and our water supplies. And we have to choose the cleanest and most sustainable path forward. Finally, Mr. Chairman, are we really ready to treat oil as just another commodity like peanuts or grain? Because if oil is no longer something to be restricted, then isn't it also time to remove the many subsidies we've given to oil over the years in the name of national security? I've never thought those subsidies were good policy, but if oil is no different than peanuts, why should it enjoy special liability exemptions under Superfund and other statutes? Why should we subsidize oil production on federal lands? These are only some of the issues I believe we have to address before completely doing away with the ban on exports. We shouldn't embrace short-term gains without understanding the long-term costs of our decisions because we can't afford to get it wrong. And to that end, maybe it would be wiser to explore some smaller intermediate steps first, such as easing restrictions on crude exports to our neighbors in Mexico, before abruptly eliminating all our national security protections for this critical energy source. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barton, for sponsoring the bill and helping begin this discussion. And I do apologize for interrupting now the questions, but I know, we're doing a lot now to get the votes for our 21st Century Cures bill, but I wanted to have the opportunity to speak on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone, and that concludes our opening statements. And once again, thank you, panel members, for coming and for your statements. And this time, I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions, and then we'll give other members of the committee that opportunity as well. Generally speaking, when we do consider the export of products from America, I mean, we've been quite successful, and it's kind of difficult to understand how, as Mr. Barton said, we can export almost anything, but we can't export crude oil. And from my discussions with people about this issue, the two primary reasons that you hear about are, number one, this is going to increase gasoline prices. And then the second reason that I've heard, that some refiners have already made adjustments so that they can refine light sweet oil that is coming primarily out of our domestic production now. And originally they were doing heavy crude and heavy sour, and they've made these investments so they can do it now. Other refiners have not made that investment, and they're complaining that it would put them at a disadvantage. But Dr. Montgomery, you had indicated, and I've heard others say this, and I would see what Commander Lippold says about it, but gasoline prices are determined by the world market price. And if more oil is being produced into the world market, you would think that that would reduce gasoline prices, and that's what EIA has said and other groups Do you agree with that, Dr. Montgomery? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And Commander Lippold, do you have a comment on this?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not an economist, so I couldn't really judge the prices. But what I can say is that if you are introducing more oil onto the world market, that creates a cushion and a degree of stability that from a national security perspective is obviously good, because it gives the ability for nations to now take in the oil and produce it. But when you're looking at our country, it's the fact that we've still got that 30% and we're trying to export that concerns you.
I mean, one of the arguments that you made, which I think is a little bit of a stretch myself, but you were saying that because if we put more oil into the market, the world market, you were saying that would be a disadvantage. And explain that to me once again.
Well, right now, when you look at the oil that we're producing, which is the light tight or light crude, in discussion, the refineries right now say that they have the excess capacity to be able to produce that, which creates the refined product, which goes out onto the market, and therefore the more you have in the market, just common sense says it's going to bring that price down. By keeping it here at home, we're able to adjust and be able to react more because we're not as dependent on other nations. It also gives us the flexibility that if we need to export refined product around the world and we're exercising that capacity within our refineries, it gives us the capability to get that product where it needs to go for any kind of an emergency for any countries, whether it is in the Pacific Rim, whether it is in Eastern Europe, because if you can deliver refined product on the bat, right off the bat, that's what they're going to need to make their economies and militaries be able to protect their nations.
Mr. Ambassador, all of us on this committee have had representatives from all over Europe talk about the importance of doing this for the benefit of their countries, and your being here today to explain those benefits is particularly helpful. And right now, how much oil is the Czech Republic consuming a day? Do you know the answer to that question? In barrels, I think you all talk about it in tons, right?
Our total consumption is 195,000 barrels a day.
195,000 barrels a day.
Which goes, as I said, about 50% from Russia, and another 50% is combined from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and other smaller suppliers.
But in your discussions with other European leaders on this issue, I'm assuming that the majority of them would support our efforts to lift this restriction on the export of crude oil.
Well, of course, as ambassador of the Czech Republic, I cannot represent or speak on behalf of other countries, but just from the perspective of the Visegrad group, as I said, this is Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. There are members of this grouping whose dependence on Russia is almost 100%. So in this respect, they would probably need to adjust their refineries and make some homework in interconnectors to be able to import other than Russian crude oil.
Right.
So then, of course, U.S. opportunity would be welcome, I guess.
Okay. Well, my time's expired, so Mr. Rush, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also want to, again, thank the witnesses. I have a question for Commander Lippold. Commander, in your testimony, you stated security benefits to changing export regulations are unlikely to materialize in the near future. Do you see any benefits to national security and our diplomacy efforts if we were to export crude oil, among other energy resources, to our neighbor Cuba? Could U.S. imports to Cuba displace Venezuelan or Russian imports? And if so, what implications might that have in the region for us politically and diplomatically?
So the question that I would look, or the answer I would give to that is going to be if we are going to be exporting it to countries to try and displace, once again, we're getting into the issue, we're beginning to parse out who we want that oil to go to, and from a national security perspective, I think most people here on the committee would agree that the number one people that we need to take care of first is going to be here in the United States. If we are dependent on oil, all we're doing is, while we may be giving our oil to one person as one type, we're still going to be taking in more amount of oil to make up for the total quantity that has to be consumed within the United States. So I don't see an immediate advantage in taking our oil and then saying, well, we'll export it. We do already export through licenses a certain degree of that oil under the existing law to Canada, and we've just prevented it from going to other nations. But if we drop the thing wholesale and decide we're going to be able to export it to everyone, the ramifications and second, third order effects on national security and stability have not been thought through yet.
Dr. Montgomery, I was just handed a study by the chairman emeritus of the full committee, and it's an IHS study. Are you familiar with the IHS study that was released in March 2015?
I'm familiar with some IHS studies. You'll have to describe this one a little bit more for me, I'm afraid.
Well, let me just quote from it. It says, in states with a diverse and mature set of supplier industries, the supply chain can account for half of the value added from lifting the export ban. Illinois, an oil-producing state with diverse supplier industries, will derive 58% and 54% of the total GDP impacts from its supply chain. Illinois consistently stands to gain from lifting the ban in all supply chain sectors examined in the IHS study. Do you have any commentary on that, which I quoted?
Yes, I think it's first missing the point that one of the primary benefits that comes from increasing crude oil production in the United States and oil exports is a reduction in gasoline prices, which accrues to everyone in the U.S. economy. I mean, it's directly beneficial to consumers. It's money in their pockets, and it in turn provides additional income for them to spend locally in their own economies. So that's one point. The second point, though, is that this emphasis on value added, I think, is a misconception and is bad economics because it's mistaking costs for benefits. The high value added in the refining sector actually means it takes more capital investment, more workers in order to produce the same amount of hydrocarbons or the same number of BTUs. And I actually think Mr. Kreinbelt used a great phrase, which I'm going to copy frequently. What we're really seeing here is a situation in which we can compete more effectively internationally as crude oil producers than as refiners. Because what we're looking at is the prospect for producing several 100,000 barrels per day in addition to what we're producing today. Nothing is being taken away from U.S. refiners. It's true, they're already using all the light, tight oil we produce today. The opportunity with removing the export ban is we can produce more crude oil, which we can export, which will help our balance of trade. Now, some refiners say, we want that oil for ourselves, but they have to make additional investments in order to use it, which means that it costs more to export a barrel of product than it does to export a barrel of crude. So we make the economy benefits more from exporting the crude because we don't have to make this wasteful investment in refining. We can invest in something else. Improved agricultural productivity for something we have a comparative advantage in.
Thank you. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to try to build on what Mr. Rush just asked Dr. Montgomery, but I'm going to ask the question to Mr. Kreinbill. I've studied that study that Congressman Rush referred to, and my understanding is that what it means for a state like Illinois, if you have a manufacturing base that supplies oil-filled equipment and supplies pipeline equipment and supplies electrical equipment, in other words, if you have a manufacturing base and a distribution base, that even though you're not producing the oil, you benefit from it. Now, that's the kind of company and business that you're in. Is that not correct, Mr. Kreinbill?
That's correct. And I think, as I pointed out, I did provide a chart in my testimony showing the correlation between the number of drilling rigs and our incoming orders. As I tried to mention in my testimony before, what really happens for us is it's not just the oil and gas or the crude that's exported. It's all the ancillary things that happen. They need pumps to build the hotels and dewater the construction site for that. They need pumps for transferring just water to and from the sites. And I'm speaking of pumps because that's my background, but I think you can take that and use it throughout the manufacturing industry. Everybody seems to benefit from an increase in the economy and the activity that the oil.
So a state like Illinois, which again has some oil production, but it's centrally located, has a manufacturing base, those small businesses and some large businesses would benefit because they would send equipment to the Bakken in North Dakota, over into Pennsylvania, even down into Oklahoma, because as the drilling rigs went back into production, their business would increase. Is that not a fair assessment of what that study indicates?
That's very correct.
Okay. I want to go to Ambassador Gondolovic. Commander Leipold indicated that if we lift the ban, most of the oil production that we would export would go to Asia, and certainly Asia would be a good market. I would point out that under current law, oil that goes through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline can go to Asia right now. You represent a part of the world that we would say would be Central Europe or Eastern Europe, and you indicated that your country specifically and the countries around you that you have economic relationships with would want to import some of this oil. So what's your assessment of what Commander Leipold said about the benefits primarily going to Asia as compared to your part of the world?
Well, again, I just want to speak on behalf of the Czech Republic only. First and second, I have to explain to you the structure, the ownership structure of the oil distribution and refinery sector in the Czech Republic. Simply said, the pipelines and storage capacities are owned by the state, while refineries and, of course, distribution of product is private. So we don't have, as a state, any influence on whose oil these refineries are going to buy. And as a state, we have actually put in place such a system that there is more opportunities from both ends for these refineries. So it gives us energy security to a certain level that even if there is a disruption of supply from one end, there is an alternative. So I cannot assure you that even if you pass this bill, there will be a direct purchase from our refineries, I mean from refineries that operate in the Czech Republic, of the U.S. crude oil, that I cannot assure and predict. I can predict that if there is an alternative coming from the U.S. as a democratic state that doesn't use exports of natural resources as a political tool, the world itself will be a more safer place.
My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
This time recognize Mr. Pallone, gentleman from New Jersey, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The initial purpose of the export regulation was to protect the U.S. from state-owned oil actors organized through OPEC, and the oil market was not and is not today truly a free market. Oil is a commodity unlike any other, and our nation is disproportionately impacted by oil imports. Secretary Moniz recently expressed doubt about the wisdom and timing of lifting the crude export ban when we still import 7 million barrels of crude oil per day, and some of those barrels come from Canada and Mexico, but others come from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. So, Commander Lippold, my questions are all of you. Is it in the best interest of the U.S. national security to continue relying on potentially volatile regions and nations for our oil consumption? And could lifting the export ban result in a decrease of lower-priced domestic crude oil for refineries in the Northeast?
Not being an economist, I wouldn't know how it's exactly going to ripple through and affect the markets, but I can tell you from a national security perspective, the fact that we are still as dependent as we are on imported oil does have an effect on our ability to act independently on the world stage.
And could lifting the export ban result in further imports from the Middle East?
I don't know if we exactly know that. One of the problems is if we lift the export ban and we introduce crude onto the market, every study that's out there indicates that the vast majority of it will go to the highest bidder. Oil will always follow the path of greatest financial gain. Right now that is going to be to Asia, and that is going to have a ripple effect that goes through every part of our economy, including Gorman Rupp. I mean, the previous testimony a few years ago, their president said that the Chinese were copying their pumps, building what they're doing, and yet we're going to be now providing them, if we export it, fuel that is going to be taking on those very industries that undermine our industrial base. That is not something we want to do.
I want to ask you something about refining capacity. We've heard suggestions that there's insufficient refining capacity for the light, tight oils that are being produced today, and that therefore we have a surplus of oil that must be exported. But do you believe that that's the case?
No, I do not. The refineries right now are indicating that they do have the excess capacity and capability to take the light tight oil and refine it for distribution.
So if refiners were incapable or unwilling to process this oil, then our discussion today would be different. However, in a recent survey of a majority of the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers Association's membership indicated that construction is already underway on additional refining capacity that will be able to process an additional 720,000 barrels of new light sweet crude a day. The new capacity is on track to be operational in 2016, and this outpaces EIA's oil production forecast. So, Commander, does this match your understanding of U.S. refiners' ability to handle or process our domestic light sweet crude?
It does, but I would also add on to that to say that not only are they working to be able to take on more capacity by creating the by building onto the refineries that exist, but one of the key things we also have to do is look at the refining industry that goes also with the production industry as well, and the amount of regulation that is imposed on them today, and figure out how can that process be best streamlined so that we can, in fact, increase capacity on both sides to be able to make us toward that long-term goal of energy independence. Everyone talks about it. We aim toward it. Now we need to start putting some of the pieces in place because, as the Czech ambassador very well said, if you have energy sovereignty, you're going to have national sovereignty. We do not have that international, or we do not have that energy independence and sovereignty right now. We are still overly dependent on foreign oil from countries that clearly we have seen, especially over the last 15 years, do not represent our interests and values. The more we can disconnect from that, the better off our nation will be in the long run.
Well, let me just ask you about the Czech Republic. I noticed that the ambassador didn't clearly indicate that U.S. oil would displace Russian or European crude. If we lift the export ban, does U.S. oil flow to the Czech Republic, and how would the Czech Republic benefit, if at all?
I think one of the greatest problems that you would have is that they're geared to take certain amounts and types of oil and refine it. If you only have, given 195,000 barrels a day, I don't know, and perhaps the ambassador could enlighten and say, this is how much is able to process the Russian crude, which is medium sour, versus the light tight oil that the U.S. would be sending them. So again, one of the great capabilities that we have in our country is in our refining capacity, in that we don't have to lift the export ban if we have the refined product available, that if energy is used as a weapon somewhere in the world, we can turn around and export refined product to give them immediate, tangible benefit that is going to help us and give us flexibility.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ambassador, do you want to respond to that?
I just wish to say that it's a well-known fact that even in Europe there is an excess capacity of refineries. So we talk of a broader picture that U.S. oil could be possibly refined in some other European refineries, not speaking of a rather small Czech market only.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Welcome, Dr. Montgomery and Mr. Kreinbill. Warm greetings to our NATO ally, Ambassador Gondelovich, and a special shipmate to shipmate welcome to Skipper Lippold. On October 12th of 2000, at 11:18 in the morning, you took the biggest hit Al-Qaeda could muster. Their bombs killed 17 of your sailors and wounded 39 more. Your leadership kept the coal afloat, and you brought her home. As we say in the Navy, bravo Zulu, Skipper, bravo Zulu. Now to the matter at hand, exports of American crude oil. This debate was started in 1975 by a law that is way out of touch with 2015. I believe that American free trade is the most powerful force for freedom in the whole world. And I do see value in ending 1975's ban. I know some refiners will feel some pain if we end the ban and stop distortions of the market caused by government mandates. But once we move through this debate, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can take a look at other distortions of the market caused by outdated government mandates like the broken ethanol mandate. These are not linked, exports of ethanol, but they have a common problem, DC in the market. Skipper Lippold and Dr. Montgomery, I've noticed that y'all have very different opinions about crude exports causing more imports of foreign crude. We each have 1 minute to make your case. Skipper, you have the con.
Thank you, Congressman. I think when you look at the imports that we have today, when we are still importing 30% of our oil, and the fact that it is not controlled in an open free market, there are entities out there, whether it is OPEC or other nations, that are acting as cartels that are influencing that market and will continue to have an undue influence on them. They will directly affect our national security should they choose, like they did in 1973 or 73-74 following the Yom Kippur War, to squeeze the oil supply, enforce an embargo, and put things on us. What we need to do is create the capacity and capability in this nation using the oil that we have at hand to refine it here at home so that we don't remain dependent. One of the greatest concerns that I have right now is that being 30%, that's like saying, hey, you've completed 8 steps of a 12-step program on your recovery from addiction to oil.
Skipper,
now is not the time to go to the bar and celebrate.
Sir, but you're relieved. Dr. Montgomery, you're up, sir. Your response.
Yes, I think that the first thing to remember is that removing the restrictions on crude oil exports will lead to an increase in U.S. production of crude oil. It's that increased production that would be exported. It's not a question of production being constant and oil being taken away from U.S. refiners to be shipped overseas. Instead, the problem is that we are seeing a big price differential indicating that U.S. oil is backed up in those fields and not being produced. If it can be exported, that's a net addition to the world's oil supply, and it's a net subtraction from the total call that the U.S. is making on the world market. And it's those net imports that matter for everything, as I said before, but in particular for national security, because by reducing our net call on world oil markets, we don't help Venezuela and
Dr.
Iran.
Montgomery, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. I ask that both of you submit, for the record, any documents, reports that justify your position. My final questions are for you, Ambassador Gondelovich. I doubt Mr. Putin will be very happy about America ending its ban on crude exports. How will his displeasure affect the Czech Republic?
Congressman, with all due respect, I would rather not comment on other nations' leaders.
Mr. Montgomery, do you care to comment about Mr. Putin's impact and maybe OPEC's impact if we export crude?
Yes. I think that I should have included Russia in my litany of those who will not be helped by lower world oil prices. Russia is currently dependent on its hydrocarbon exports for foreign exchange and for keeping its economy going, and both allowing unlimited LNG exports from the U.S. as well as removing restrictions on crude oil would take away from his economic power.
Thank you. Go Navy, beat Army.
This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank Mr. Barton for bringing this issue up, and I thank the panelists for an interesting discussion this morning. It looks like there's about 3 issues that are involved here: the impact on domestic prices, the impact on national security, and the environmental impact. So the first 2 sort of go hand in hand. Dr. Montgomery, I believe you stated that it's all about imports, net imports and net exports, so that if we export more crude than we import refined product, we're on the winning side of this thing. Is that what I understood you to say?
No. Our increased exports of crude oil would not be offset by increased imports of refined products. Unless people start consuming more gasoline because the price of gasoline has dropped, there's going to be no change in our product consumption. So it would be a net, so that to a first approximate, back of the envelope, the amount of additional oil that we produce and export is a net change. It's not going to be balanced by increased product.
Well, I didn't mean that we were going to import more. I meant that if we export more than we import, then we're on the winning side of this thing. That's what I understood you to say. But my problem with that is that if we depend more on imported refined product, then we have to secure our sea lanes, which has a very high cost that the consumers aren't going to pay at the pump, but they're going to pay through our national defense authorization. Would you agree with that, Commander?
I think that there is going to be a certain amount of sunk cost that's going into any safeguarding of the sea lanes of communication for the global economy. The issue is that if you begin to increase more coming to the United States, obviously that lifeline is going to become more important for us. And yes, we would have to develop more assets to put out there. And while that may be a cost, I'm certainly not going to turn down any opportunity to have more ships built to do that.
Thank you. The environmental impact is also at surface here. I think the increased production has been very good for our economy, but my concern is that the technology that we need to keep production clean, by clean I mean carbon, greenhouse gas emissions from production, greenhouse gas emissions in transportation, that they're not there to keep up with the demand that would increase if we lifted the export ban. I hope, did I make that clear? I guess I'm concerned about the environmental impact of increased emissions, increased groundwater contamination, especially in California, if we lift this ban, precipitously. Would you agree with that, Dr. Montgomery?
Not entirely. I mean, yes, their increased activity in producing oil will produce somewhat, well, The activity of producing oil itself is not going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. Let me stop there. It's only if that increased production of crude oil does in fact reduce gasoline prices. So first of all, we have to all agree that allowing exports of crude oil would cause gasoline prices to fall. If we all agree on that, then yes, there would be some increase in consumption of gasoline in the United States. We actually calculated this in the study we did.
But I'm not talking about consumption. I'm talking about fugitive gas emissions in the production process, fugitive gas emissions in the transportation process. And I don't think our technology is there yet to make sure that increased production in the United States and increased transportation in the United States and overseas is going to be carefully done. I just don't believe we're there.
I believe it is. I have been watching this industry for 40 years. There are occasional
if that's the case,
accidents.
then
they
why are they
operate
burning
safely?
Let me regain my time. Why are they burning off so much gas in the production process?
In the Bakken, it's being burned off because they can't build the infrastructure fast enough.
Well, that's my point. They don't have the infrastructure there yet.
But that's
to
not
protect the production that's already being done. So if we increase production, then we're going to get more of that.
We actually count.
And I'd like to fall back on what the commander's observation was, that the U.S. dependence is on 30% of imported oil. We really aren't in a position to precipitously lift the ban. I think we can do it in steps, and it would make sense to increase production in exports in steps, but not precipitously. We're not there yet. I'll yield back.
Jim yields back. This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great hearing, and I appreciate those who are here. The ranking member, Mr. Pallone, really said an interesting statement. At the time that, and he's still here, so hopefully I get it right, the restriction, the current restriction was based upon our desire to protect our economy against state oil interest, state-owned oil interest. That's why we did it in the 70s. The international security debate today is now we need to export oil to protect our allies against state-owned oil interest. We're in a different era. We're in a different age. Commander, when you sailed the 7 seas, I was on the West German border. My defensive position was across the border from a country that was called Czechoslovakia at that time. That country no longer exists. You have the Slovak Republic and the Czech Republic, and they're our allies. And I spent a lot of time in Eastern European issues. Just returned with the speaker from Lithuania, Finland, Poland, and Ireland. And they want to free themselves from the grip of oil extortion by Russia. So the world has changed. And I also take issue with the flexibility debate that you have about why we shouldn't export, because you have more flexibility to respond if you have more crude oil on the world market. Recovering crude oil is not something you can do overnight. It's a time-consumed process of investigation, drilling for discovery, and then drilling for recovery. And it takes a long process. So right now, the United States, we export refined product. Why do we export refined product? Does anyone know? Because we produce more than we consume. So, Commander, you wouldn't ask the United States to not export refined product when we produce more than we consume, would you?
No.
Okay. And so the debate on our refinery capacity, and we have it too, I've got both sides on the aisle who are trying to make this argument. But the ideal is we want more crude oil on the world market, economics 101, supply and demand. You have to be an economist to understand that if demand remains the same and supply increases, price goes down. The only political fear is there's some unplanned disruption in a refinery, a fire, that there's a price spike, then everybody gets caught by that. So I only have two minutes left. I want to cover one. Eastern European national security relies on expanded exports. Whether it's LNG or crude oil, they are begging the United States to be involved in this market for their own security. The second thing is the economic argument for pricing is sound. More crude oil on the market, demand remains the same, prices go down. And the third thing, Mr. Kreinbill, you mentioned it, and it's true, Ranking Chairman Emeritus Barton and Mr. Rush were talking about jobs related, and we were talking about the state of Illinois. Well, Southern Illinois is exhibit number one. We're ready. We have marginal wells. We were prepared for using the new technology. Prices went down, and there's a halt in any activity of recovering from the Illinois basin, which is probably going to be one of the most productive basins in the country, because now the pricing is just not there. So the local schools have lost revenue, the local counties have lost revenue, the job creators, the haulers, the steel mills have all lost the ability to create jobs because of a policy that was designed, and I'll just end on this, a policy that was designed to protect us against state oil interests. Well, we don't have to fear state oil interests anymore. They have to fear us as we put our crude on the world market. So with that, Mr. Chairman, not many questions, but a statement of listening to the testimony.
It was a great opening statement there. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask my full statement to be placed in the record. Most of you know, and maybe not the panel, but I represent a district in East Houston that at any given time over the last 20 years, I've had all 5 of our refineries in the Houston Ship Channel in our district. And I can tell you, and growing up there, this is the best time to be in the refining business in Texas that I've ever seen. And I know the issue is that most of those refineries were retooled in the 90s to handle our overseas crude, Venezuela, you name it, heavier crude, because that's all we could get. But now we're seeing some of those refineries actually retooling to take our lighter sweet that we're getting. Now, it's millions of dollars of investment. It was millions of dollars to turn those refineries around from lighter crude in the 90s to heavier crude, and it's going to be that. So our engineering companies are doing very well right now. But, Mr. Montgomery, you mentioned massive refinery investment would be required in the United States. And do you know if that is occurring to handle the lighter sweet?
Some is occurring, but not the amount that it would take. But my understanding, when I look at studies that were done by Baker O'Brien for EIA,
so there is some. I only have 5 minutes, and I need to get to another panel.
Got it. Yes, there is some taking place, but not enough to use all of the light tight oil that could be produced if we knocked out the differential.
My response to that, not everybody switched over to heavier crude at the same time in the mid-90s either. Mr. Ambassador, when you talked about the refining capacity in the Czech Republic, and I know Europe has a lot of other refinery capabilities, but you said that to handle the lighter sweet from the United States, that your refineries would also have to be retooled to handle that lighter sweet. Is that true for Europe in general, or is it just for the Czech Republic?
I think, and I'm not an expert in this field, that taking about 50% of non-Russian crude oil, the capacity is there to handle the light sweet.
Okay, well, maybe I misunderstood earlier. You said that there would be, you would have to be investment to retool those refineries to handle the lighter sweet.
If there might be a disruption of deliveries from the east, further retooling might be necessary.
Well, again, as a policymaker in our country, I would much rather we have that investment in our refineries. And even though I want to help Europe, well, both with LNG but right now we're doing very well sending low sulfur diesel from Texas over to Europe. And those are the jobs that we have in my East Harris County. They're very high paying jobs at those 5 refineries. And there are refineries in my area who are retooling to handle that lighter sweet to make sure we can do it. Because you can't move a ship very quickly, and you can't move a refining industry very quickly because of the high cost of the investment. But now we know there's enough lighter sweet coming out of the Eagle Ford in Texas, and even in West Texas, where we thought Midland, Odessa was dead for production. But now we're seeing just amazing production out of that. And I think you'll see a lot of our refiners doing like they're doing in my own district and along the coast of Texas. It's starting now, and we will see it. So if we start exporting it, we will lose some of that incentive to have these downstream jobs. I have a district where I have a lot of folks who produce oil too. I represent a lot of service companies, and I want them to be working in the field. But I also want to see that we have that industrial capacity in our country, like the Admiral said, or Commander, I'm sorry, I promoted you. You should be an Admiral, but I like your testimony. That we need those downstream jobs to make sure we have that industrial capacity. My colleague from Pennsylvania has steel plants. We used to have them, but now we buy so much of our steel from everywhere else in the world. But I lost those jobs. I don't want to lose our refining capacity jobs. And again, I only have a few seconds. I support exporting LNG because we have a process for it. And granted, Department of Energy, and this committee has looked at it, has been too slow in deciding their national interest. But I've talked to my colleague, Mr. Barton. If we want to create a system like that where we don't price ourselves out of the market on exporting crude oil, like I would worry about chemical industry, we're not going to see that because we're going to make sure that exporting is in our national interest for LNG. And I think we could do the same thing for crude oil. But again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I could spend all day with the panel. But
at this time, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, how has the use of energy, by regional players shaped the Czech energy policy and planning?
How has the use of
energy diplomacy or energy as a political weapon, however you want to categorize it, how's that shaped Czech energy policy and planning?
Our main policy is diversification. So we do not want to rely on one energy resource technologically and geographically, or I would say in terms of foreign supplies. It applies on our domestic energy policy. So as I mentioned before in my testimony, we wish to develop both nuclear as well as conventional energy sources. Also, we put a lot of emphasis on renewables, but we do not exaggerate their importance. So mix and diversity is our policy. And the same thing applies on resources of energy that we do not have in our country, oil and gas. Speaking of gas, you may also have noticed that the Visegrad Group countries, the 4 countries I mentioned, about year and a half ago turned with a letter to Speaker Boehner to initiate a relaxation of U.S. Strict export policies on gas export. So the same logic that applies to gas exports, I believe, would apply on our position and position of other Visegrad Group countries on U.S. policy of limitation of crude oil exports.
Thank you. Commander Lippold, would you explain again your assertion that lifting the export ban would increase reliance on foreign imports? The Energy Information Administration, leading experts, academics in the energy field all seem to agree that removing the U.S. crude oil export ban would likely increase U.S. production and reduce imports. Would you, what's the basis of your assertion?
When you produce more oil and you put it on the world market, that oil is going to go wherever the highest bidder is going to take it. So we can't control where it's going to go, whether it's to Eastern Europe and our partner allies over there that may need it because of energy weapon being used as a weapon, for example, Russia. Every study that I've read says that the majority of that oil is going to go to the highest bidder. Right now, that is going to be China. Obviously, that has huge national security implications. When I look at the oil that would be produced and the fact that we have it, necessity is going to be the motherhood of invention. We are going to be able, whether it's through fracking or other things, I have never said don't ever lift this ban. What I'm saying is if you just immediately drop it, we have not thought through those national security effects. Right now, one of the things that I worry about is that I think everyone on the committee would agree. We would like to have a national energy policy that is dovetailed and marries in with a national security strategy, protected with a national military strategy. But when you look at, if we were to just open it and do it, all we have are studies. There have been conflicting studies on what that effect would be. There have been conflicting studies on the price impact that it has. What it doesn't do is that when you're still 30% dependent on oil, to begin to start exporting that oil overseas when we have not even solved our energy independence here at home doesn't make common sense.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. You discussed the cost and investments that domestic refiners must make relative to costs associated with exporting crude. In short, can you tell us what would make the U.S. economy more efficient, refining more crude or allowing for exports?
Unquestionably allowing for exports. Essentially what we are doing with the crude oil export restrictions is raising gasoline prices in order to subsidize a select group of refiners. In essence, the crude oil export restrictions are price controls. They're price controls on a particular kind of oil. The refiners, I think, can see that they're benefiting from that because otherwise they wouldn't have any reason to oppose lifting the export restrictions. So I think we will have some refinery investment, which will take up some light tight oil, but it is still going to strand a great deal of oil that could otherwise be produced because without those price controls and without those subsidies, U.S. refiners can't compete selling all of the light tight oil in the world market without a subsidy.
Thank you. My time's expired.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. I find it very interesting, fascinating. You know, I've been in Congress 21 years, and I've heard colleagues on both sides of the aisle constantly talk about the goal of making our country energy independent so that we could free ourselves from having to import oil from the Middle East and Venezuela. And the reason we don't export oil is because we were importing so much. It seems kind of crazy, at least in Pittsburgh, that you would talk about exporting something that you're still importing. And I want to say another thing, too. There's no urgency to do this. I'd like to put into the record an article that appeared in the Financial Times just 2 days ago entitled, "Oil Market Throws Cold Water on U.S. Export Ban Push." You know, we talk about letting the market work. This is very interesting. It says the oil market has thrown cold water on the push to repeal the ban. The price of U.S. crude has been remarkably strong against global grades, undermining the contention that export restrictions have imprisoned domestic supplies and forced producers to sell at these deep discounts. Last week, the spot price of light Louisiana sweet crude on the U.S. Gulf of Mexico coast was $61 per barrel, more than the price of $59.09 for dated Brent from the North Sea. The article concludes by saying, an analyst from Citigroup, if the U.S. crude export ban is removed and light sweet crude starts to flow out of the U.S. Gulf Coast, it would struggle to find a home in the well-supplied European market. It would only add to the oversupply in the Atlantic Basin and could hurt Brent more than it helps WTI. it could well be an instance where U.S. upstream players should be careful for what they wish for. So, Mr. Chairman, I think that we can slow this process down. There's no urgency to do this, and start to consider some of the ramifications if we just simply open up, lift this ban, which will never be put back in place again. I would say to my Pennsylvania colleagues, by the way, to be careful what this does to our refineries in Philadelphia, because it damages them greatly, and a lot of that has to do a little bit with the Jones Act, which I'll get into later. But I think we ought to slow this process down. Why wouldn't we be talking about taking this excess light sweet crude and tooling up our refinery capacity to keep it here in the United States, and eventually, over time, become the energy independent country that we keep telling our constituents we want to be? I mean, this doesn't make a lick of sense to me as policymakers who are supposed to be thinking 20, 30, 40 years down the road for the next generation, not how can we make a quick buck on the disparity in oil prices. I mean, that's not our job. Our job is to look after the future of our country, not to look after how people need to make some more money in the oil industry. I have a couple questions. Did I go over my whole 5 minutes, or has that clock been running? There's no way I spoke 8 minutes and 50 seconds, Mr. Chairman. So
I think you've spoken too long, Mr. Doyle.
I mean, were you just so enraptured with my speech that you forgot to put the clock on? So, I think you only used
let me just say you were mesmerizing.
I think you only used a couple seconds. Let me ask the panelists. The Energy Information Administration reference case from the 2014 projects that U.S. tight oil production, which is the type of oil largely responsible for this oil boom, is going to increase in the coming years and peak at about 4.8 million barrels a day in 2021. This was up from 3.5 million barrels a day in 2013, and it's been a huge increase from where we were in the year 2000. However, except in the high resource case, production then begins to decline. Commander Lippold, are you concerned that this legislation essentially permanently lifts the ban, even though we may start to see a decrease in oil production as early as the 2020s?
So that would clearly be one of the considerations that needs to be taken into place, is the long-term predictions on what our oil production capacity is going to be, and the fact that if you lift this ban precipitously and take it off, that the ramifications that it would have, exactly on the point you made, what is our national security impact going to be 20 to 30 years from now, needs to be thought through. That's why I say let's take a longer, slow down the approach and take a look at either a phased in or a more thought out process.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there's a more responsible way to allow for some of this oil to be exported? I mean, is there a different mechanism that we could do this for, or do you think we should just keep the ban in place?
I think one of the great things about our nation is that we, in fact, have the capacity, that we are developing this oil, that it is going to be out there, and that we're now going to have a greater degree of flexibility at aiming and working toward that energy independent country that we want to be. But I think that we shouldn't lift it immediately. Could it be lifted at some point? Absolutely, yes. Should we lift it at some point? Absolutely. Less regulation is better for the country as a whole.
Thank you. You know, we saw changes to refineries in the 1970s to process new types of oil, and I know that some of the refineries in my home state of Pennsylvania have made those structural changes to process the new oil we're benefiting from today. I've read that a large number of refineries will follow suit to benefit from the oil boom. I think many refineries are going to start to make these structural changes in the coming years. Commander Lippold, I'm a strong supporter of Americans working and of organized labor. And I'd like to, if you would comment on how the Jones Act plays in this, because I've talked to my refineries up in Philadelphia, in my state, and there's some concern that because of U.S. flag ships, the Jones Act, it may actually cost more money to take that light sweet crude up to our refineries in Pennsylvania than it would be to send them over to Europe. And that's going to cost a lot of jobs, high-paying union jobs that we sustain families on, that we're very proud of in western Pennsylvania. And I want to know the effect of that, because I've got colleagues on this committee from Pennsylvania, two Pennsylvanians on the other side of the aisle, that I think want to hear what the effect this is to Pennsylvania refineries.
I have not studied, Congressman, the effect of what the Jones Act would have. Knowing that that oil will be transported, I haven't run the analysis to find out what the economic cost would be to ship that oil overseas versus keeping it in the U.S. to a certain degree, because if you look at it, if we were to start pushing, though, one of the things you have to consider if we do drop the Jones Act or we impact it in some way, or if we change lift the export ban, is obviously going to have an impact on the American shipbuilding industry as well. That's one of those ramifications or ripple effects that we need to think through and study.
Dr. Montgomery, how about your analysis of how the Jones Act plays in this?
We did actually look at that, and on that I agree with you completely. If the Jones Act were even lifted for shipments of crude oil in between U.S. ports, a great deal more of the oil that we could produce from a great deal more of the light tight oil would go to U.S. refineries in the mid-Atlantic than it will with the Jones Act in place. So yes, the Jones Act is clearly hurting the refineries in Pennsylvania, and lifting the Jones Act along with removing export restrictions would keep a lot more of that crude oil.
Well, let me make it clear. We have no intention of lifting the Jones Act in the United States Congress, just so that's clear. That's not going to happen, but it is going to negatively impact our refineries in Pennsylvania. Mr. Chair, and I would just end by asking that we put this article from the Financial Times into the record, and to say that the studies I've seen of the refineries in Europe is that they're actually designed to process medium sour oil, not light sweet crude. I don't think most of Europe is going to benefit from this at all.
Yeah, we'd like to get a copy of that without objection. I might also say that the record is going to be open for 10 days, and we are also working for an accumulation. There have been so many articles written on this issue, and we're going to enter all of those into the record because we want a full record. And our staff is working with some groups to compile that list of articles now. So thank you. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our panel. It's been a very interesting discussion today, and we appreciate your patience for taking our questions and listening to us. But if I could start, Dr. Montgomery, with a couple of questions for you. I just want to just double-check some facts here. You know, when we're talking that right now, fortunately the numbers coming down, that we're at about 27% of our oil is being imported in this country. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think my quick check here is that that's back to the lowest number that we've been since 1965. And is it correct that we're using about 18.7, 18.9 million barrels of oil a day in the United States?
It sounds like the right number.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we'll assume that's correct.
Yes.
Okay. And if you take that 27% of the oil that we're importing, another quick number, is it correct that Canada is our largest supplier of imported oil?
Yes.
Okay. And then would Mexico, where would they fall? Would they be close to second, third, somewhere in that?
Mexico has trouble with production sometimes, but yes, and basically Western Hemisphere sources, aside from Venezuela, are where we get most of our oil.
Okay, so we've been very fortunate in the last few years that we've weaned ourselves really off of the imported oil from maybe more from the Middle East. We're looking at the Canadian and Mexican oil being really pretty much our main area. If you're probably over 50% then, or close to it today, would you calculate that number at that?
Yes.
Okay.
We get only occasional shipments from the Middle East at this point.
Thank you very much. Mr. Crimeville, we're almost neighbors. I'm from Wood County, and you're from down in Mansfield and Richland County. And in my district in northwest Ohio, I've got 60,000 manufacturing jobs. And, we've had a boom in the state of Ohio because of the Utica Shale. And now I don't think that Utica has quite made it into Richland County yet, or they've found the discoveries there yet. But I know that there's been questions that come to you a little bit earlier, but could you go back into it a little bit? Because again, when you look at the jobs that are produced, especially the jobs in your industry, could you get into that a little bit more about what the Utica has meant in the production in the state of Ohio, and also with the shale development over in Pennsylvania with the Marcellus, how that's helped your business?
there's been quite a bit of activity in both of those, the Utica and the Michelles. I guess what I would point out to answer that question is the chart that the Energy Equipment and Infrastructure Alliance provided, and it really shows the number of different manufacturers and suppliers that are involved in this industry. And being in Ohio, I've seen some of the growth. Matter of fact, as I drove over here yesterday, I was in traffic with some of the equipment that was being moved through the state. So it has an effect that as there's more activity going on, whether it's pumps or something else, there's just a lot of activity all over from a manufacturing and supply standpoint. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because also, and off the top of my head, I can't think of it, but like in unemployment numbers in the last several years, how's Richland County doing, the Mansfield area?
Richland County, we lost a General Motors plant here recently, so Richland County has been really suffering with unemployment. I will tell you that a college roommate of mine lives over in Carrollton County, or Carrollton, Ohio, and there's a lot of activity over there, and it was really booming until the price of oil went down.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, if I could, in my remaining time, just ask a couple of quick questions. And, you know, some of us on the committee have been privileged to be able to meet with a lot of, especially Eastern and Central European leaders. And the discussion you had about the diversification that your country is looking at, you know, why do you think, and we've heard this, and you've had some certain members like Mr. Shimkus and some others bring this up, why is it that Europe's looking to the United States for energy needs into their future?
Well, as I said, the more resources of energy that are coming from stable democracies, and in this matter from United States as an ally, moreover, the better for us countries that are relying on supplies from the outside.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired and I yield back.
We thank the gentleman from Ohio and now recognize the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the witnesses. Thank you for your testimony today. My overriding concern is with the American consumer and with America's national security, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to export American crude oil to the People's Republic of China while increasing costs to American consumers and refiners. Commander Lippold, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. You have a very distinguished record of service. And I heard you loud and clear that you pointed out that the U.S. still imports a staggering amount of oil, and you've urged us to be cautious, to consider the real-world consequences. You say, while tempting from the perspective of gaining a commercial foothold in a new market arena at this time, the national security implications of changing the existing policy regulating the export of crude oil is rife with unknown and probably unintended consequences that must be fully considered and addressed. Now, you've spent a lot of your career on international security concerns. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is happening in China, whether it's their increasing cyber security attacks, whether state-sponsored or not, what's going on in the South China Sea, especially their reclamation of islands and lands to seemingly want greater control over the shipping channels. What's happening with China's military strategy?
What you are seeing in China today is a country who has taken their economic power and wealth and is beginning to expand it on a first regional basis to gain greater influence over the countries that are around there. China has always viewed the South China Sea as their lake. They view that as entirely their territory. They tend to ignore the territorial limits at 12 miles or the exclusive economic zone that goes out to 200 miles. They say that they can expand, and if it's disputed, they're the big guy on the block, so they'll do what they want, and that's what you're seeing with the building of the islands there today. While we have tried to engage with the Chinese, and I think we should continue to engage with them on a very positive basis where and when possible, clearly they have taken actions recently that are not in accordance with our interests or values, whether that has been in cyber warfare, how they're dealing with things regionally, how they've dealt with us economically, and obviously Gorman-Rupp's unfortunately been a beneficiary of their trademark violations and in stealing our equipment and know-how, American know-how. So on a variety of fronts, we just need to engage with them positively where we can and punish them where we have to in order to make sure that they behave responsibly in the international community.
I mean, their international strategic plans have been quite interesting. I can't help but think back to when I traveled to Afghanistan and all of the American money, the treasure, the lives that we poured into that country. And then it was pointed out that it was China that was exploiting their minerals. The same is happening all across the globe, where the Chinese reach is just enormous into Africa, into South America. And I don't know why the United States of America would be party to supplying China, the largest importer of petroleum across the globe, why we would help them gain that strategic foothold. I take your advice very seriously, and I think it should give this committee something to think about. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. We now go to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could start with Dr. Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery, there was a moment in questioning earlier ago that you were trying to answer about the flaring excess at production and the impact increases in production might have, and I don't think you got a chance to finish that. Did you care to comment on that further?
I did. Thank you very much. Yes. What I wanted to say was that we looked at this and did some computations in the study that we did at NERA. And what we found is that using an oil export ban to try to limit field emissions or greenhouse gas emissions associated with fuel consumption is about the worst possible climate policy you could think of. The administration just announced that it thinks that a ton of CO2 does $36 worth of damage. Well, we calculated that the economic benefits of oil exports that you would lose through the ban amount to several $100s per ton for every ton of CO2 emissions that you could avoid that way. It's just, I mean, there's so many other ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to deal with the problems of, appropriate regulation at the field that the oil export ban is just about should be at the bottom of anybody's list as a tool for environmental policy.
Let me ask you this. Are oil export restrictions one of the main reasons why West Texas Intermediate crude trades about $5 less per barrel than its international competitor Brent?
For a time, there was a problem with pipeline capacity for moving it. At this point, I think that is exactly the reason. The same thing is true of Bakken in North Dakota trading below Brent. It's because and in fact, in the last couple of weeks, well, in the last day or two, Bakken has actually popped up to being pretty much equivalent to Brent, and what the news reports were saying was that priced U.S. refiners out of the market. So the fact is that, yes, it's the fact that it's not economic to be used in the U.S. that drives that price down.
In my home state of Mississippi, we have the Tuscaloosa Marine Shale that was really beginning to take off. The cost per well was going down, and then, of course, the price drops out and production stops, and that's been an issue. But I've seen estimates that show that eliminating the discount that we just talked about would incentivize a significant amount of investment in the United States. IHS estimates perhaps as much as $750 billion over the next 10 to 15 years. What impact would that have on the U.S. economy broadly, and who would benefit?
That kind of investment is basically a driver for economic growth. The growth that the slow growth that we have had in the past few years has almost we wouldn't even have had that were it not for the investment that was going on in the oil and gas industry. And as Mr. Kreinbill has described, that investment stimulates activity throughout the economy, not just people working on drilling in the oil fields. It provides us with lower cost energy, and it's a driver of economic growth. So that investment, as long as it's driven by the market and is not driven by government subsidies to refiners through effective price controls. So all investment is not the same. The market-driven investment that we've seen because of a technological revolution in the oil and gas industry, that clearly drives the economy forward. Taking money out of consumers' pockets to subsidize a set of refiners doesn't.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Mr. Kreinbill, if I could ask you a question. If the export ban were to be lifted, how would you change your business plan to adjust for the more positive outlook?
Well, we have our business plan already in place for, as I mentioned, last year when we looked at our business plan for this year, and we have to look at, okay, if things increase a certain percentage or decrease a certain percentage, what do we do? What it would mean for us is making sure that we hire the people that can create the product.
Let me ask this, because my time's almost up. How quickly would you see that positive impact? How quickly?
I don't know that I can comment on that. It depends on how quickly the oil rigs get back in and the demand increases.
Okay.
There's quite a bit of supply now.
My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. We now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very, very wonderful hearing. I think we've all learned quite a bit, and I want to thank all the panelists. I do want, although my colleague from Texas is no longer here, Mr. Olson, one thing we can't agree on, and I've expressed this concern directly to General Dempsey when I was on the Armed Services Committee, as a proud father of a stepson and daughter-in-law, both Naval Academy grads, although they're in the Marine Corps now, but go Navy nonetheless, Commander. Also, Ambassador Gondelovich, good to see you, as always. For 8 years, I proudly represented Cedar Rapids, Iowa. No longer, but they have a wonderful, of course, as you know, the National Czech and Slovak Museum there. So thank you for being here today as well. I do want to start out with you, Ambassador. If you could, because I realize that a lot of what's going on here, the proposal to lift the ban on crude oil exports is based on a concern for our national security, for the national security of the countries where hopefully the oil would be going. Whether it would or not is another question. Can you talk a little bit about the national security interests at stake here for the Czech Republic when it comes to where you get your oil, where it might come from if this ban were to be lifted?
Well, again, since the changes in 1989, we saw energy delivery and energy sovereignty as a part of our national security, and this is why we put such an emphasis on diversification. And so in my whole testimony, it's of course representing a country that has done all possible measures to enlarge opportunities and diversify resources of energy. It is not my role here to tell you, the U.S., what you do with your national security, but I'm representing a country that is prepared to accept deliveries even from the U.S. As or when, if the ban is lifted, and is actually convinced that those deliveries would benefit to our national security as it is coming from an ally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And again, I feel for you as the ambassador. You're not a politician, yet you've been kind of put in the middle of this here today, and I thought you've done a very good job representing your country and serving as the ambassador and not a politician today. So thank you very much for what you've done today as far as your testimony is concerned. Look, we had another hearing on this issue a while back, not on this particular bill, but on the issue of lifting the ban on the export. And I stated at the time that my biggest concern, not unlike others up here today, is our national security, the U.S. national security. Everyone here knows that prior to 1973, America had essentially a drain America first oil policy. I think we can all acknowledge that. Driven by the Seven Sisters, driven by domestic interests here in the United States, and pursued by Congress and pursued by the various administrations up to that point. So I have a real concern myself about lifting this ban from that standpoint, given that we still import 30% of our oil, given all the other considerations. I understand the economic arguments. I get all that. You know, markets are going to drive prices, all those things. But at the same time, you know, I just think we have to be very careful that we don't do something in the short term, which, while it may benefit certain actors in the United States, private industry in particular, in the oil industry, that we not, as my colleague from Pennsylvania expressed his concern on the same issue, that we look down the road, that we don't do something now in the short term that's going to have a very, very negative effect on our national security, on our economic security, on the security of the United States. That's why I do appreciate your testimony, Commander. And again, I appreciate the testimony of everybody here because you're all coming at this from kind of different perspectives. And we have to take into account all those perspectives. There's no question about that. But I do have a question as to, and I stated this question when we had this hearing the previous hearing similar to this, is there any guarantee if we lift this ban that the oil is going to go where we might want it to go from our national interest perspective? And Mr. Chair, I see I'm at the end of my time or near the end of my time, so if I don't get to an answer, I would like to request answers in writing from the panelists. Commander?
Without objection, Mr.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are you yielding back now?
If you need me to, I will. Yeah.
Well, your time has expired.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I'm a little rusty at this, see, but we're only supposed to get 5 minutes. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your patience on the panel. But almost 2 hours ago, there was a remark that was made, and I've heard it over the last few years, that if we're going to have exports, we ought to at least tax it or get some kind of a fee on that export. And all I can say is, with all due respect to those that want to tax our exports, that will require a constitutional amendment. Because there's a prohibition under Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 5 in the Constitution. It says, no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. So I just want everyone to understand, as much as some people might want to take advantage, you just can't do that. So some of my questioning is looking for consistency. We seem to be here in Congress often picking winners and losers. I don't like that. And in this consistency, I come from a coal state. We export a lot of coal. Now we're in the process, and actually, if I could stay on coal just for a minute, with this increasing demand for coal around the world, we haven't seen a rise in the price of coal. Coal has been a very stable marketplace to be able to have that product. So I reject some of that notion that if we export it, we're going to see a rise in price, because I haven't seen that with coal. And now we've got the argument that seems to be moving on LNG, that we're finally going to start exporting our natural gas, both for diplomatic purposes and economically. What's the consistency here that if we say it's all right to export coal and natural gas, but government is going to involve here and say we're not going to export oil? Is that consistent? So, Commander, I'm just curious because you seem to be the designated contrarian for this panel. Do you support the export of coal?
I think you have to look at it in the total context of energy security and what we're capable of producing and what nations need around the world. Right now, we're still importing 30% of our oil, and until we reach that point,
Just on coal, do you support the exporting of coal?
I'm not. I'll be honest, sir. I'm not familiar with coal and the industry, so it'd be inappropriate for me to comment.
We export about 15% of what we produce in coal because obviously this administration doesn't like us burning coal in America. So we found we've got markets overseas to produce that. What about LNG? Do you have is your view consistent that you would also oppose exporting LNG?
Again, I have not gotten into LNG, although I will look at it, and having studied it to a small degree, when you look at our ability to export and have an immediate impact, especially on the Eastern European countries that are overly dependent on Russian gas, that is a critical national security issue that we are contributing positively toward and should continue to work for, especially as we develop more fields and have that excess capability in our system where we're taking not only of our needs that are being met, but now can give it to other nations as well.
I appreciate it. I know we've been running over here long, so I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. We now go to Mr. Taka for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to see us become less dependent on oil, imported or domestic, but that has not yet been achieved. Until it is, I think we need to proceed cautiously. This is not just another commodity. It's one we have paid a high price for in blood, treasure, and other environmental and social costs. So, Commander Lippold, I appreciate your testimony and your perspective on this important issue. As I understand it, Venezuela and Saudi Arabia have the largest proven reserves of oil, more than 250 billion barrels, and that Saudi Arabia's oil has production costs that are lower than ours, amongst the lowest globally. And given that situation, it seems difficult to assess much about the overall direction for the price of oil without a sense of what the Saudis plan to do. I also imagine that since a number of countries rely on oil revenues to meet their obligations, they will continue to produce and sell into the market, even if that means they may be selling below their production costs. So I don't see how increasing exports of the U.S. produced crude is going to have much impact on the global price of oil. And given that during that period, the period that our crude oil export ban has been in place, we've seen significant increases and decreases in prices at the pump. I doubt consumers will see a net benefit from lifting the export ban. I can see that this change could alter decisions about whether to continue investing in domestic refining capacity. I can see that it can alter decisions about whether to drill additional domestic wells, and I think it will also influence decisions about investments in oil pipeline or oil transporting rail cars. So, Commander Lippold, in his testimony, Dr. Montgomery refers to the prospect that the refiners would make additional investments to refine more light oil as economic waste. But those investments create domestic construction and related manufacturing jobs and maintain or create domestic jobs in the refining industry. My question to you is there strategic value in keeping a strong domestic refining industry?
Absolutely, yes.
And you indicate in your testimony that you believe lifting the export ban would lessen the trend to declining imports. Would you expand upon that a bit?
If you look at, if we were to increase the capacity of the refiners here in the United States, while they have some excess capacity right now to take in the light tight oil that is being produced here in the United States, if we create the conditions and they expand that capacity, going from the heavy sour to the light sweet, that is going to give us an ability to refine it here in the United States, which is going to lessen the dependence on oil that we have to import in order to meet U.S. domestic needs.
Thank you. And if drilling slows down, we may reduce the immediate benefits to some in the oil sector, but it may give us a chance to catch up on other things we need to do to better adapt to the new production areas. For example, in the areas of transportation and pipeline safety, the oil isn't going anywhere. If it's still in the ground, it's still available for our use. In a sense, it maintains another form of strategic reserve. Would you agree with that?
I would agree to that with a caveat, and that is, while it may be there, just as with any industry, you are now asking industries like Gorman-Rupp to be able to keep a capacity available so that if we decided we needed to exercise use of that strategic reserve, that they could immediately tool up and be able to expand it. That's a consideration you have to look at is, do we have the capability and capacity in the industrial base to maintain that in addition to keeping those strategic reserves in the ground? That has to be thought through. And again, this goes back to the point of my argument, which is before we lift that ban, this is one of those second and third order effects that we need to look at, is how do we maintain that industrial capacity that if we have to exercise use of that strategic reserve, can we and how quickly can we get our industrial base to tool up to be able to do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, lifting the export ban clearly would benefit the oil production sector by drilling and other ancillary services. It would maintain or expand growth in pipeline investments and rail investments. These sectors have done very well, and the boom has spurred tremendous growth, but it has come at a cost. My constituents, for example, are very alarmed at the rapid rise in the number of oil trains rolling through our region. They do not believe that investments in safer rail cars and contingency plans for dealing with accidents have kept pace with the increase in oil production. If now we are incurring these costs only to export the oil, support for expanded domestic production will be even less popular than it is already in non-oil producing areas of the country. And so I just share these concerns with the committee and here at this hearing because they're real and they're lived through each and every day. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kramer, who's been here the whole time, is not a member of the subcommittee, so he's going to have to wait until the two other members of the subcommittee ask their questions. We now go to Mr. Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for having this very important hearing. As I alluded to earlier, Oklahoma has lost 20,000 jobs since January. Obviously, we're a rich state in our fossil fuels, and it's very important. It drives our economy. And to have this conversation, to me, as a business owner, I'm just sitting there scratching my head. And Commander, I hear what you're saying, and I understand your point of view. But strategically speaking, when we start talking about our allies, I mean, we're forcing South Korea right now, who we're still heavily invested in, to buy oil from countries that aren't exactly friendly to us right now. How is that possibly a good idea? How is it that if we can't at least export crude oil to our allies, don't we weaken their hand when we make them dependent on those that don't exactly have our country's best interests in mind?
Well, if you're to use that as the bottom line, we'd be in trouble in a number of areas in what we import.
Well, it's not the bottom line, sir. It is where we're at. It's the point. I'm not talking about everything. We're talking about export of oil, of a commodity that we have an abundance amount of right now, and a commodity that, honestly, we're running out of storage in the U.S. We're at record level storages, and we're holding on to it. We have plays that we haven't even started in. We, without doubt, could be the #1 producer, not because of government intervention. In fact, they're choking us because of the entrepreneurial spirit. We have the ability to strengthen the hand of our allies and strengthen our relationship with our allies across the country for providing them a commodity that they're in desperate need of. We got the check sitting right beside you. Is that not an opportunity to strengthen their hand by taking them off the dependent of an unstable and unreliable Russia right now?
I think one of the concerns goes back, sir, to the fact that, once again, if we don't look out for our interests first, while our allies may be important, at the end of the day, we're the ones that are still going to be vulnerable and dependent, and we've seen that with exactly the impact that has affected your state. When you look at country, or not a country, but a cartel, principally driven by Saudi Arabia, that can influence the world oil market in the way they do by depressing prices, by putting more on there, not reducing their production quotas, and allowing that to happen, even if we put our oil on the market,
Commander,
they still have the capacity to lower that down. And
Commander, you're making my point,
depressed.
because as a business owner, to stabilize the market, you put more players in it. Competition strengthens the sword of an entrepreneur. We allow them to control it because they're the only player on the market. We have reserves. We have the ability to go out there and not compete, but beat. You're talking about our economy and our security of our nation? Unemployment brings insecurity. Security is when we have a strong financial stability inside our country. We've lost 20,000 jobs, and yet we have it underneath our feet, and we can't get it because we don't have a place to take it to. We're putting it in storage, as I alluded to earlier. We put it in storage, which we're running out of storage capacity. It is absolutely crazy to think that we limit the ability of entrepreneurs. That's the only thing driving our economy at the so-called recovery we're having. We're limiting their ability. We're not talking about the 70s anymore. We're not talking about running rogue on stuff that depleting our oil. The technology has changed. The world has changed. And the world is in desperate need of another player in the world market so we're not held by the cartel of the Middle East. Right now, our refineries, 30% of our refineries in the U.S. is owned by foreign entities. And they can bring their oil to us. They can buy our refineries. They can refine their oil. They have a place to bring it to. And yet we limit ourselves. From a strategic point of view, sir, I find it very hard to buy into your argument when we're not able to shore up our own allies at this time, at this critical time. We have an opportunity to become a world leader. All we have to do is loosen the rope just a little. Thank you for being here, and I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. I apologize to Mr. Johnson. I thought Mr. Mullen was here before you, so I erroneously allowed him to go first. But we now recognize the distinguished gentleman from the great state of Ohio and a catcher on the congressional baseball team.
Go Bucks. Who got no playing time this last game, by the way. We can talk about that later.
Obviously a managerial mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time. I want to take just a minute to talk about the incredible journey these past few years have meant for the folks I represent in eastern and southeastern Ohio, where the vast majority of the exploration and production of shale development have been occurring in the state. Thanks largely to the oil and gas industry, unemployment in shale counties has fallen some 66% since 2010. Counties in my district, which have historically seen higher unemployment rates than both the state or the national average, are now driving down the state's overall unemployment rate. But certain challenges are now coming into play, challenges that have recently caused about 1,000 rigs to be laid down across the U.S., resulting in an estimated 150,000 layoffs. That said, we have an opportunity to address these challenges, and I believe it starts by looking at our outdated energy policies, many of which were crafted when America's energy resources were considered scarce. That is why legislation like the LNG Permitting Certainty and Transparency Act that passed the House back in January, which helps America harness our natural energy abundance by requiring DOE by law to act on pending LNG export applications in a timely fashion, is so very much needed and important. This legislation would stop Washington from further delaying job creation at home and will help positively influence global politics abroad. And after much thought, I believe the current crude oil export restrictions are also standing in the way of real economic and geopolitical benefits. As you all well know, GAO recently testified that removing these restrictions could increase domestic production to an additional 130,000 to 3.3 million barrels per day from 2015 to 2025, while decreasing consumer fuel prices. Lifting the ban would also create American jobs, and like the LNG Permitting Certainty and Transparency Act, it would strengthen America's geopolitical hand globally. So while I understand that lifting these restrictions will cause some bumps in the road, it's hard to ignore the numbers contained in the GAO's report along with other recent reports. And I think if we go about this the right way, we can smooth out those bumps in the road so that everybody in America wins and we take our rightful place as the world's leader in energy exports. And so with that, Mr. Barton, even though you didn't play me in the game, I'm going to forgive you for that. I'd be happy to lend my name to H.R. 702.
Well, thank you.
To support your
We'll
bill.
have to rectify my managerial mistake.
All right, we'll work on that. We'll work on that next year.
All right.
I'll be back. Now on to a few questions. Mr. Craneville, in your testimony, and I know you got a business in Mansfield, right?
Yes.
And you've got a friend who owns a business, I think, in Carroll County as well.
Yes.
In your testimony, you touched on many of the harmful impacts that the export ban has had on your business, such as laying off workers and wage stagnation. Do you know of other companies who have been similarly affected by the export ban, and what do they have to say about it?
I think there's many suppliers in the industry that are affected by it. You know, a lot of the suppliers to us are affected by how our business is and whether they're supplying us castings or any of, you know, the raw materials that we buy. It's affecting them also.
Okay. Would you expect these negative impacts on your business to continue getting worse if the ban is not lifted?
It seems like as the number of rig counts go down that our business is directly correlated to that, yes.
Okay. Well, to the extent that you can, and I understand it may be hard to quantify, can you give us some idea to what extent the export ban has hurt your business, your ability to expand and invest?
I think if we lifted the ban, we'd create the marketplace for then, you know, the economy to pick up and generate business and the need for supplying that market with our equipment and equipment like ours.
Okay, so basically your sales would go up, you think, as the market expands. That
yes, and again, it's correlated to, our sales are very much correlated to the number of rigs and the activity out there.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We thank the gentleman from Ohio. We're now going to turn to the gentleman from New York City, the Big Apple, the late arriving, but always welcome, Mr. Engel. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for always being concerned with this important issue. So I want to thank the Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing on the current ban against crude oil exports. Let me first of all say the United States has more influence over global energy production today than we've had in generations, and that's a terrific thing. It's certainly vital that we pursue a smart and responsible course for energy production distribution. We develop our energy resources while vigorously protecting the health and safety of all Americans. Our nation can realize enormous economic and energy security benefits. Mr. Barton knows, because he and I have discussed this, that I have been interested and continue to be interested in the geopolitical aspects of this. The fact, and our ambassador can attest to the fact that Europe is so dependent on Russian oil, and then if the United States were to lift a ban, it might make Russia less important, and I think that's a good thing given the way they've acted in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. And so I think that to help wean Europe off of Russian energy, this might be a good thing. So I'm particularly interested in the global ramifications of lifting our crude oil ban and the impacts it would have on jobs and the economy in the United States. Now, since we held a hearing on this issue last December, I note that two unions, the Laborers International Union of North America and the International Union of Operating Engineers, split from the AFL-CIO position and now support lifting the crude oil export ban. Mr. Barton and I have had discussions about this. So we heard as testimony today that if we lift the ban on crude exports, and the vast majority of U.S. crude purchased on world market would make its way to Asia, not Europe. I also read a Wood-Mackenzie report from March of this year that concludes the same thing. So let me ask you, Dr. Montgomery, do you agree with the conclusion that if we lift the ban, the vast majority of our crude oil exports would go to Asia? And if you do, does it matter?
Yes and no. I'm sorry, but yes. Asia is a large market, but it's not one we are particularly well set up to serve. I mean, we'd be moved if the refining is taking place in the Gulf Coast in mid-Atlantic. That's a long way to get to Asian markets. So basically, I think it is extremely hard to predict exactly where a physical barrel of oil is going to move, mainly because it's irrelevant in thinking about the global market. Whether we load a ship in the United States and follow that ship around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope or the Suez Canal to get it to Asia, or whether that oil goes to Czechoslovakia, freeing up some oil that Czechoslovakia might have purchased from Russia to move to Asia, it's all going to have exactly the same effect. It's not where the barrels go, it's how much there is in the total world market.
So let me ask Commander Lippold, I think you'll disagree, but let me hear your disagreement. Commander, do you agree with Dr. Montgomery?
You got to put your microphone on. You got to push the button.
Yep, sorry, sir. I would say yes or no. While the oil goes in there and we can't trace where that barrel of oil would go, clearly you put more oil onto the world market, the highest bidder is going to get that oil, and transportation costs will be absorbed in that total thing. Right now, the majority of that oil is predicted to go to Asia, and studies indicate that.
So let me ask about imports. Despite the recent increase in domestic crude oil production, the volume of oil that the U.S. imports is not drastically different from the time the ban was put into place in the 1970s. The U.S. Information Administration, according to them, imports in 2014 totaled more than 2.6 billion barrels, or around 30% of supply. So testimony today, we've heard that lifting the crude oil export ban would result in a greater reliance on imports than would otherwise have taken place. So I'd like to ask Dr. Montgomery and Commander Lippold, do you agree? Dr. Montgomery?
No, I do not believe that. I do not believe that lifting the export ban would lead to an increase in imports. It would. I look at net imports. The additional production that we would be exporting will be far larger than any conceivable increase we might have in refined product imports. So on balance, we are going to reduce our import position is going to improve if we export the crude oil.
Commander?
I believe that if you're going to start exporting and you're still importing 30%, that fact isn't changing. It still affects our national security in a negative way because we're not achieving that goal of energy independence.
And Ambassador, let me ask you one quick question. Do you agree with my premise that if the United States exported more oil, it would help to wean Europe off of Russian energy?
Congressman, I cannot assure you that in the Czech Republic refineries would start buying American crude oil once you possibly lift the ban, but the mere possibility that there is an alternative from the deliveries from East would definitely strengthen our security, and not only the Czech Republic, but the entire Europe.
I know other countries agree with you and the Czech Republic about these things. Mr. Barton, we'll continue to have conversation. Thank you.
We appreciate your testimony and your attendance. Last but not least, the long-suffering gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for introducing the bill, and thanks to all of you for your patience, because you've been here and you haven't even left, and I've been able to go up and get out a couple times. I want to hone in on this issue of the impact of a free market on everybody, because we sort of pick where we want to pick and pick situations. I mean, one of the examples, Commander, you referenced Asia a number of times. It might surprise people to know that in 2013 the United States exported nearly 50 million barrels of refined petroleum products to China. I don't find that offensive any more than I would find selling oil to China offensive. But my understanding of a free and open market and its impact on security in the world is, you've used the word, Commander, you've used the word energy independence many times in the context of national security. I frankly think that that's only half of the formula. I think energy security is different than energy independence. For example, and Mr. Mullen raised the point, I think we've established that we import roughly 27% of the oil that we refine in the United States. He raised the point that 30% of our refining capacity is foreign-owned, largely by the people that are importing, that are exporting or we're importing the oil from. I don't see a lot of incentive for them to change their refining and retooling their refining to take our oil when the whole reason they own those refineries is to import their own oil. So we export a lot of things out on the Atlantic Ocean that we import back on the Pacific Ocean other than oil. We do that regularly in agriculture products. We have pasta plants in North Dakota that buy low-cost durum from Canada, and our farmers sell higher-priced durum to producers in Minnesota. I mean, that's how a free market works to the benefit of everybody, and I think we're missing some of that. I would be interested to know, perhaps Mr. Montgomery, you could start, this issue of the 30% ownership of foreign ownership of our refineries, whether you find it offensive or not offensive. That is relevant, is it not, in the context of this discussion of energy security and energy independence?
To me, the importance of that is that those foreign owners are actually benefiting economically from having access to the U.S. market and are richer than they would be. And I think that if our enemies are poorer, that's better for the United States. But those assets are still in the United States. The fact that they might be owned by Lukoil or by Venezuela doesn't make them not available to us should there be a national emergency, or should we, if we went to war with Venezuela. It wouldn't change the operation of their refineries if we had to take them over.
And I would agree. I don't mean to imply that I'm offended by it. I'm not offended by it, but in the context of this discussion. Anybody else on that topic, including you, Commander, since I'm sort of jabbing you a little bit on the issue?
Well, yes, thank you. And it goes actually to the heart of what I have talked about, which is when you look at energy independence and we look at developing as part of a national security strategy and having an energy policy, when you look at those refineries and 30% being owned by foreign interests, when you look at 30% of our oil, or 27, being imported into the United States, if you want to look at it at a free market perspective, we don't have a free market. There are always going to be a certain degree of regulations on what we control, goes where, to whom, and under what conditions. That's part of what government's function is, to ensure that there is a certain degree of level playing field, not only internally to the U.S., but externally to the United States. So I would look at it, and I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about that 30% ownership and what they're doing. It's what is going to be available and what conditions are we creating for our people in the United States to perhaps push that 30% out and create those jobs for the U.S. and for the end money to end up here in the U.S.
But I guess I see in this case the regulation creating an uneven playing field to the disadvantage of the American producer, and that's sort of the whole point in the whole issue. I want to ask, Mr. Ambassador, you've said a couple of times or referenced this. I want to ask it in a real specific question. Do you believe, representing just your country, that the world would be safer if the United States was a force or a player in the global marketplace, being the stable, reliable provider of crude oil?
Yes, I do believe that, and I have tried to prove that in my testimony.
You've done very well. Let me ask quickly, Commander, since I have a couple seconds, do you think that displacing heavy sour crude from Venezuela with heavy sour crude from Alberta, Canada, would be better and more in the national interest than would make us safer?
If importing it
from Canada rather than Venezuela?
I think anytime we're taking something not from Venezuela, it's for our best interests.
Thank you. I appreciate your support for the Keystone Pipeline. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. That's all the members No other members present to ask questions. We'll keep the record open for the requisite number of days.
Mr. Chairman, if you would, Mr. Chairman, before
Gentleman from Illinois.
conclude the questioning, I do have a question.
Well, then we'll recognize.
One final question, because I'm interested in Commander Lippo's reference in his written statement, where he said that Nigeria and the impact that lifting the ban would have on the Nigerian government and its fight against extremists. This impact on Nigeria, can you be more explicit about that? That is of concern to me.
Yes. What you're referring to is the fact that Nigeria produces, along with Azerbaijan, the same type of light sweet crude that we do. If the export ban is lifted, one of the second-order effects you will have is you're now introducing a larger quantity of that oil onto the world market that is going to affect their market share, potentially depressing prices. Clearly, Nigeria being as overly dependent upon oil to support their economy, it is going to have a ripple effect. If the price goes down, they're not going to be able to maintain the type of economy that they need to keep their nation functioning. They're clearly faced with a clear and present danger with the terrorist group Boko Haram. They would take advantage of potential economic instability to try and destabilize, if not topple, that government, which would have ramifications. And this, again, sir, goes back to the core of my argument. This is one of those second and third order effects. Before we precipitously just lift the ban and move forward, it has to be thought through. A point that was made a few minutes ago was that, let's lift the ban and we'll deal with the bumps in the road. I, too many times in my military career, lived through the consequences of that happening with national leadership making those kinds of decisions. We need to be reactive, not reactive, but instead plan ahead for what we're going to do. If we think through what the ban's going to do, there hopefully will come a day where we can lift it and do that. But today is not the day because we have not thought through those effects.
Do you have a counter to that argument? And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so much for your liberalism.
Be careful how you use that word. But we'll let Dr. Montgomery answer your question.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Two brief comments. One, to paraphrase, no economic plan survives contact with the market. And this notion that we could plan out all the consequences of a change in policy, I think is a fantasy. What we have to do is look at the basic principles of free trade and the way in which the market will work, and the way in which our ability to buy and sell goods internationally has benefited the economy for hundreds of years. As far as Nigeria goes, again, there are unintended consequences in every direction. We have frequently analyzed the consequences of lower world oil prices on different regions of the world. The fact is, most countries in Africa are oil importers rather than oil exporters. They're the poorest countries in the world. Anything that we do to reduce the world price of oil is going to benefit those poorest countries in the world because they need it and they will pay less for it if we put more oil in the market and make it cheaper.
Thank you. I am so tempted, using the power of the chair, which I currently have, to say that a quorum is present. I ask unanimous consent to move the bill as is. Call for the ayes. The ayes have it, and the bill is reported out. But that would not be proper form.
It sure wouldn't be, Mr. Chairman.
I won't do that. I do want to first. I have some business. We would ask that 3 letters from the Energy Equipment and Infrastructure Alliance, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and America's Natural Gas Alliance be put in the record without objection.
No objection.
Okay. I would also ask to thank our panelists. And before we close this hearing, just put a little bit more context on this. We've had a good discussion today. We've talked a lot about exports and imports. I want to put some information in the record from the Energy Information Agency. And we import about 9 million barrels of petroleum products a day. but we export about 4 million. So on a net basis, it's about 5 million barrels per day of imports. Of those 5 million barrels, about 3.5 million come from Canada and Mexico, who are geographically adjacent to the United States. In fact, Canada is the number one source of our oil imports. Number two, Saudi Arabia, which is a little over 1 million barrels a day. Last year, U.S. production increased over 1 million barrels a day. And if we were to repeal the ban on crude oil exports, now this is an opinion, this is not a fact, I believe that we could easily increase domestic production another 1 million to 2 million barrels a day in the next year or 2 years. So if you really think about it, we do have the ability to move from a time in the 1970s when we had to import oil from overseas. We've been as high as 74% of our oil coming from overseas. We now have the capability that the only oil we import is not by necessity, but because of economic availability. That is a real possibility. That's not fantasy. And removing the ban on crude oil exports puts the market in play. I don't discount what Commander Leipold has said, but I do believe if you let markets operate and let the world's largest producer, which is the United States of America, let our producers have the choice to sell domestically to domestic refiners or to sell on the world market, they're going to produce more. And if they produce more, there's going to be more competition, there's going to be more stability, there's going to be less reliance on unstable sources or sources that are in unstable parts of the region. So we talk about imports, and the commander's facts are correct. But if you look at it from a net import basis and give the capability of our domestic producers to produce, we, for all intents and purposes, have the capability to be energy independent in the real near term, and I think that's important in the debate. Chairman Whitfield has asked me to indicate, and so has Chairman Upton, that this is an issue that is got a real chance to be marked up. No decisions have been made yet, obviously, but it is something that's under active consideration. With that, again, I want to thank the panelists, and this hearing is adjourned.